British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and other European leaders have promised to boost military support for Ukraine. The so-called Coalition of the Willing has been holding talks in London, attended by Ukraine's President Volodymr Zelenskyy. Keir said there had been progress in freeing up frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. European leaders also backed new US sanctions targeting Russian oil producers. President Zelenskyy said the Kremlin was using the coming winter to put pressure on his country. Well, the Prime Minister said it is vital to support Ukraine now and when the war is over.
We will keep up the military pressure on Putin through the continued provision of long-range capabilities. And finally, while now is the time to prioritise pressure, we're also continuing our work on security guarantees, including the multinational force Ukraine, to uphold a just and lasting peace when that day finally comes. Because, and I say it again, Ukraine's future is our future.
Let's get more from Terry Schultz, who's covering those talks from Brussels. Well, welcome, Terry. So what did we learn?
Yeah, I think you heard Keir Starmer say it there, really summing things up. This entire meeting was focused on how to increase pressure on Vladimir Putin, how to choke off his funding for waging war on Ukraine, and how to bring him to the negotiating table. And I think Volodymr Zelenskyy, as well as the rest of them, must now be really appreciative of how seamless the cooperation is. When you looked at who was at that meeting, it was chaired by the UK, but then you had leaders that are both members of the European Union and of NATO there. You had the NATO Secretary General, along with President Zelenskyy. You really have both of these organizations working together because NATO, of course, can help coordinate military support, but you cannot sustain that without the financial backing that can only be provided on the European Union side. You did hear them talk a lot about trying to unlock these frozen assets of Russia, trying to make Moscow pay for the destruction it's wreaking on Ukraine, as well as in Denmark's case, saying they should actually be paying for the weapons that Ukraine needs to defend itself. Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, who's also currently the rotating head of the Council of the European Union, said that she would like to see a plan for unlocking those frozen funds in place by Christmas Eve, she said, so that Ukraine could go into the new year knowing that it's got funding for the next couple of years. Now, that is a plan, of course, that has a lot of roadblocks still, but significantly, we heard the UK, which has 30 billion euros worth of assets frozen in its country alone, say that it is now willing to work with the EU moving forward on that plan.
OK, so we have the UK saying that they'll jump on this plan if it comes off to use those Russian assets. But beyond lots of talk about putting pressure on Vladimir Putin, could we point to anything that European leaders actually achieved today?
You did hear some new announcements about more missiles, some more strike capabilities coming from NATO countries particularly. But this is something that happens. You do see duplicate meetings. For example, we just had a NATO defense ministers meeting last week where Ukraine also would have heard about the military assets that allies are willing to transfer to Ukraine. You know, I'm sure it doesn't hurt for him to hear it repeated, and also for Zelenskyy to have multiple opportunities to pressure his allies and friends for more assistance. But really, it cannot be overestimated how much Ukraine needs more air defense. You see cities and individuals being targeted by drones and airstrikes every day, every night. So this is something allies are really focused on: more air defense, more missiles in the hands of Ukrainians to shoot down these Russian air attacks.
But aside from a nice warm feeling, it sounds like President Zelenskyy is not going back to Kyiv with anything significantly new in his pocket.
I'm not sure how many of these announcements came as a surprise to him, particularly the UK and France saying they're going to accelerate the delivery of missiles, which helps in his air defense. But I think that if you take the whole week together, where he was just here yesterday in Brussels and overnight before that getting really long-awaited support from the United States, finally putting some sanctions on these big Russian oil companies, I think that Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and he alluded to this yesterday here in Brussels, is going home quite satisfied with the scaling up of support. Really, now that you have the U.S. and the EU's 19th package of sanctions against Russia just passed yesterday, he does have more support. Again, it's not a game changer overnight, but certainly they do feel that especially these U.S. sanctions are going to start making a difference in Russia's war economy. And that's essential for them to stop this just incessant assault on Ukraine. So I think he's hopeful.
And a quick word about the security guarantees for a post-war Ukraine that Keir talked about. One of the more controversial issues amongst Ukraine's allies. Just explain why that is so controversial.
Well, it depends on which part of security guarantees you're talking about. I mean, providing weapons is part of security guarantees. But the most controversial part is, of course, whether these countries in the coalition of the willing are willing to send their own citizens into potential deadly combat, because we don't know yet what a peace agreement would look like. And it's important to remind everyone that we're only talking about NATO and coalition of the willing soldiers going into Ukraine to secure a peace. So that's probably a long way off. But they don't have any idea what that deal is going to look like. They don't have any idea where the Russian troops are going to be staying inside Ukrainian territory, which is likely at the beginning. They don't have any idea what the rules are going to be if Russia does attack these soldiers. Will the U.S. come swooping in to retaliate against Russia? We don't know that yet. That's something that the coalition of the willing has been waiting on the U.S. to clarify, and it hasn't happened yet. So there are a lot of unknowns, and really what the coalition of the willing does, as you rightfully point out, is provide moral support and a promise that if and when a ceasefire comes, we will have your back, Volodymr.
Thanks for that, Terry. Terry Schultz in Brussels.
DW's correspondent Birgit Maas is following this story in London, and with the coalition divided on the issue of sending troops to Ukraine after a ceasefire deal, I asked her why it's such a controversial topic.
So some countries find that controversial because it's not clear what would happen if there was a confrontation with Russian troops. But we also know that that this coalition of the willing, it's not only about concrete numbers. That's what we've been briefed. It's also generally showing the support, showing the Americans that Europe is willing to basically pull its weight when it comes to helping Ukraine militarily with weapons, but also when it comes to financial support.
DW correspondent Birgit Maas there reporting from London. Thank you, Birgit.
Well, earlier, our correspondent in Kyiv, Nick Connolly, told us about the expected impact of US sanctions on Russian oil companies.
I think this is a big deal, especially coming from Donald Trump, who so far has refused to make good on any of his promises to actually turn the screw on Vladimir Putin. This is real, this is major, this costs Russia significant money. These two oil companies make up for basically 2/3 of Russian oil exports. 5% of world production, according to some statistics. And I think at least initially it will scare off lots of those buyers of Russian energy in China, in India, and other countries, even in Europe, who have been buying Russian oil, who will be worried not only about what happens to those companies, but also if they themselves will be sanctioned by the US for dealing with these companies. So I think that is a major step. But I think seen here from Ukraine, it is about a first step in a direction of putting more pressure on Russia, giving more weapons to Ukraine, also, putting more pressure on the Russian side, because basically over the last few months, the only pressure we've seen coming from the White House has been on Volodymr Zelenskyy and basically never on Vladimir Putin, who has just basically fed Trump with promises of more talking, of more summits, but been very unwilling to actually make real concessions on the ground.